you so much.
Okay. Sorry about that. Thank you very much for this invitation, and it's really lovely to be here in person. So today, what I'm going to do is to share some work with you that I've been doing with Seung-Won Kim, who's a graduate student at the University of Maryland, Michael White, might be a familiar name to some of you, who's at Brown University, and Xavier Gomez-Olive at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. And what we've been trying to do is to unravel a puzzle that has become quite complex as we've gone through this analysis, and in fact is reflected in the fact that we've now changed this title, to try to unpack the link between parenthood, children's living arrangements, and migrant well-being in South Africa. And this is definitely work in progress, so I really, really welcome feedback. And some of this stuff that we're going to be talking about is actually new terrain for me, so I would love to get some suggestions. So I approach this question, just to be clear, not as a migration researcher, but really as a family demographer. My sort of, my interests are really in family structure, family dynamics, parenting, children's well-being. But I think this issue of trying to link it to the context of migration is an important one. And what I'm hoping to try to show you through this work is that we may be in need of actually trying to think about new ways to think about migration and family formation and family well-being. And I think, even though this is about South Africa, I think some of the questions that we ask are actually quite relevant to many other contexts as well. Okay, so just to set the stage, I think the story of apartheid South Africa and the very pernicious system of labor migration that separated families is actually extremely well documented, right? But we know very little about parenthood, parenting, and the impact of both on migration in the context, of migrants in the context of migration in present case, South Africa, which is 30 years after the collapse of apartheid. And I want to just share with you, this is actually a print by a South African artist, S.S. Goje. And this, as you can see by the title, An Unwelcome Return, I think encapsulate the situation under apartheid, which was, this was not a system that necessarily worked for everybody. It might have worked for mine owners in Johannesburg to have labor, but this was very, very destructive to families and to well-being. And this is sort of the classic case of a migrant returning and not being wanted because he hasn't sent back remittances, and so there's all this resentment. And I wanted to share this with you because I think we have this idea that the migration system is one in which there's risk diversification, and so the idea of actually families separating is almost like a means to an end. And I think what I want to try to shift the conversation to say, well, actually, it may never have worked, certainly not in the South African case, and particularly now, as I'm going to get to the next slide. So why? So today, South Africa is a place in which there's still very, very high unemployment, which necessitates mobility to secure a livelihood, but is precarious and often not secure enough to accommodate children. Now, the good news is there are no more restrictions in the movement of the Black population, which has, of course, led to migration destinations being much more varied and moving towards smaller towns. Migration has become increasingly feminized, and extended kin are stretched in their ability to care for children. So that idea of sort of the family being there as a safety net is definitely being tested in many ways. There's improvement in transportation communication that does enable more contact, which obviously feeds into how these systems work. And the last and very important part is the country is undergoing a complex health transition in which stress-related health conditions are garnering much more attention. So what are we asking? Our questions are, what does parenting among migrants look like in South Africa today? To what extent is parenthood associated with sleep health among migrants? And to what extent is children's living arrangements associated with sleep health among migrants? And we're also going to be looking at whether the sex of migrant parent matters, does the destination of the migrant matter, and does employment status matter? And our use of just to sleep health we're looking at is actually a marker of stress. And I should just be, full disclosure, this is still sort of new terrain for me. So particularly those of you who have more knowledge on sleep research, I would love to get some feedback. So why should we care about this? Well, globally, there are, and this is probably an underestimate, 193 million migrant workers who've left their families behind. And globalization and technological change suggests that this phenomenon is not likely to abate. And while both internal and international migration processes are institutionalized in many contexts, the returns to migration are far from certain as employment insecurity grows. And some would actually argue that in South Africa today, the situation is actually much worse than it was under apartheid. And there is much, much more income volatility, and employment instability is actually a huge problem. So then I think the fourth one, the overlap of migration and parenting entails specific challenges for parents, children, and other caregivers, particularly in economically precarious contexts. And here I think you can even look just at what's going on at the border in the United States with separation of children and the ways in which migrants are navigating and managing both their agendas to seek better employment, but also to keep their families intact, and how this actually plays out. And also that we think that this is important because it contributes to the growing research on adult health, physical and mental, in the global south. So very just a brief, in terms of the literature, there's actually quite a bit that we know of the children left behind, right? And this is our own work from several years ago, when we showed the children of migrant mothers are less likely to move if there are mother substitutes in the household. We also know that there are benefits for education for children, particularly through remittances. Other work has shown that parents leaving children behind, there's no effects on child mortality or on cognitive development. But there's other work has shown that there are negative effects on psychological and emotional well-being of children. Right? So then when we get to the other side, so what happens to the parents, most of this research is transnational and it's qualitative. And so this is just some of the work that I've been able to find, that mothers from Central America feel incredible guilt about leaving children behind, report feelings of loneliness and depression. Other work in the Netherlands amongst Angolan and Nigerian transnational parents also shows lower levels of subjective well-being. And then in one of the few studies on internal migration in an African context, again, mothers express serious concern and significant stress about the well-being of their children, even if they were left in the care of close kin. So what's our contribution? Well, one, we're going to try to actually focus on internal migration. And we're trying to actually center children and parenting in migration research. And let me just maybe explain what I mean by this. If you take sort of a framework like NELM, the Economics of Labor Migration and Risk Diversification, and this is my interpretation, and if you don't agree, please say so, but children are either in some sense invisible because there is that you put off childbearing until you finish sort of migration and financial security. So in some sense, it's a selection effect, right? Of people, especially with fertility, or if you have them, then they're going to be left with grandparents, whatnot, so that you can now focus on making money to feed back into the system. And I think what we're going to try to show, particularly in a context like South Africa today, this actually process may not be as selective as it has been, and that parenting is not actually happening as sort of in a sequential where when you sort of finish migration and then you get to parenting, but there's a lot of overlap. Partly because the returns to migration, if anything, have actually become even more tenuous. Okay. So we're also interested in looking at focus on being a parent as well as the living arrangements of children. So what does it actually mean to be a parent? What does that do to stress? Which is somewhat of a different question than where your kids live. We have a large random sample from a known population where circular migration is prevalent. And I think this is probably one of the first studies, certainly in the African context, to be looking at sleep as an outcome. Okay, so when I thought about this sort of conceptually, I was trying to figure out sort of how do I position this? And I thought about sort of migration and parenthood. So some researchers I've just alluded to have shown that migrants postpone childbearing until they're stable, which is a rational decision making. Now, however, in South Africa today, and I would argue in many African contexts, women and men continue to place a very high value on childbearing. And identity, particularly for women, is connected to childbearing, right? So therefore, migrants may be trying to meet multiple objectives simultaneously, and women in particular may be entering parenthood as a way to actually stabilize unions. So there are multiple processes at stake. So one, yes, you are going to different places in search of employment, education, other ways for social mobility, but you're also trying to stabilize unions, and to have children itself is still a marker of identity. So there are all of these things that are actually impacting that people are navigating. And so it is very possible that not having a child could be as much as a source of stress as having a child. Because I think we tend to think about children, particularly in a migration framework, as basically a burden, as a sap on resources. And I think what we're trying to really ask here is that actually true? So we also looked at the stress literature, and a lot of this is from the US, but I did like this definition quite a bit by Abedin. He sort of defines parenting stress as a difficulty parents perceive while raising children in the context of their commitment to parenting roles. And I think that's useful, the way I think about it, because as migrants, you have you are obviously committed both to the well-being of your family and your children and to your roles as parents, right? At the same time as you are committed to improving your livelihood and through migration. And we know that parenting is a source of stress, particularly for women. Balancing work-family obligations, community conditions, particularly violence, which in the South African case is a huge reality. The relationship quality between the parents, employment conditions and income instability or stability. And then lastly, the living arrangements of children. Where are these kids? In itself could also be a source of stress. They can be with you, and that is a particular form of stress, or they're not with you, and that is another form of stress. And then we also know that social support can obviously mitigate some of these effects, particularly in the form of kinship. But as I've just sort of alluded to in South Africa, and as well as in many African contexts, this role of kin is actually also something that is changing. And both in terms of the norms that are operating in terms of who should be taking care of children and also their ability to provide care. And the other thing that should be in here, of course, in the migration story is remittances, which can also mitigate some of these effects, right? So that if you are sending back money, it might actually mitigate some of the stress you might feel from not being directly involved in caregiving for your kid. So for me, I'm also interested in thinking about space and time. And what I mean by space, there's an old concept called sort of stretched households, in which parents and children are physically separated. And you could even think about it in a new economics of labor migration framework in which various people are in different places for specific reasons, to make money, to get a better education, which would then feed back into the family system as to actually strengthen the safety net. And kids are left in the care of grandparents and others, right? And indeed, that this was also culturally acceptable for kin to be involved in this childcare. But I think what I'm trying to think about right now in the context of present day South Africa, what does actually space, both close proximity as well as physical space, what does that actually translate into in terms of stress? And then in terms of time, I'm a huge fan of Glenn Elder's work, and I think this is important, that there are changing, we know that, what did Elder say, that there are changing expectations and obligations affect individual decisions and outcomes. And in South Africa, I think the desire for and the ability to participate in what is known as the socially dispersed child rearing has actually changed over time. And this assumption that the safety net is always there to sort of pick up the pieces, I think is highly problematic because of some of the reasons that I've said. So this is just a diagram that was sort of adapted from Perlin's work, which was helpful to us to sort of think about this process. And the society culture piece on the left is where sort of some of the changing norms happen, what I just alluded to, as well as the big sort of political economic factors in South Africa that influence everything from the labor market to the shutting down of mines and retrenchment and all of these sort of big processes that are at play, and stressors. So obviously, migration itself is a stressor. You've got huge income loss, income volatility, income instability, and then of course the separation of children or children being with you could be again a stressor. And then in terms of the resources here, again, I think what's interesting to me is while children are usually put in the stressor category, at least, and I think what I'm actually, when I show you the results, if there is a time to start thinking about children as actually possibly a coping mechanism to actually handle other kinds of stressors. And then, so social support, obviously this is where the kin links, particularly extended kin who are taking care of your kids, they belong there, as well as remittances. And in the South African case, there are other things like childcare grants that could also play a role in buffering these systems. And together, on the right-hand side, what are sort of mental health outcomes? And in our case, we're going to be looking at sleep. And I should say the data set, I mean, this is more, I suppose, more conceptual because we don't have all the data to actually get at every one of these issues. But for me, it was helpful to sort of organize where the pieces come together. So why look at sleep? Well, we know now that there's a lot of growing research that looks at the effects of stress on sleep. There's a growing literature that links insufficient poor quality sleep and, interestingly, oversleep to health outcomes. I think we're much more familiar with the sleep deficiency, but from what I've been reading, that actually oversleep is also as problematic. There's literature that links social relationships and sleep quality. So, for example, strong social support is associated with good sleep. Strained relationships linked to poor sleep quality. The parent-child relationship has been understudied, particularly in a non-Western context. So really what we're asking is, to what extent are social relationships between parents, children, and the caregivers of non-resident children associated with sleep outcomes? Now, one challenge, one among many, is the conceptualizing sleep. And from my read of the literature, and this is where I could definitely use some help, sleep is a physiological process. So sleep disturbance due to complex changes in brain activity and chemical imbalances linked to stress, right? But then there's also sleep as a resource. And I think particularly time use studies show that Americans essentially substitute sleep with work. And so there's this sort of substitution effect of employment and sleep. The unemployed just have more time to sleep more. And you could probably do the same thing with, of course, childcare time, right? So if you have a child, you're going to be substituting the time that it would take with sleep. And when I get to the results, you'll see that this has been a difficult one to try to parse out because, which one of these is actually our using sleep as a marker of stress. Is it the same as actually, it's not the same thing as just saying this kind of time substitution. So we've been kind of battling this problem and trying to figure out what to do with it. In the South African context, there's now several studies that say that the poor sleep quality is actually a huge problem. And this is just from upwards of 30%. And therefore, and it's also starting there's work going on that's linking this to a whole load of adult health outcomes. And so this is how we're sort of thinking about sleep as an outcome. And so if there are sort of hypotheses based on everything that I've said, having young children as a migrant is associated with problematic sleep because of additional responsibility. Co-residence with children is associated with problematic sleep because of parenting stress. Or you could look at it the other way. In this kind of a context, separation from children may be associated with good sleep because you have assurance that children are safe and cared for. And your current conditions as a migrant are so precarious, particularly in terms of physical and economic insecurities, that this system might actually work to your benefit. We think that effects will be worse for female migrants because of cultural expectations of parenting and disadvantages in the labor market. And it is true that Black women in South Africa have, I think, Black men's unemployment right now, conservative estimates are at 40%, and for women it's over 50%. And that also that effects vary by destination. What I mean by this is that going to a place like Johannesburg, which is of course economic powerhouse of South Africa, but it's also a place which has got lots of crime, and where migrants live are highly physically insecure locations. And so there's a precarity of both financial and physical that might actually make this process differ, being there versus somewhere else. Okay, finally to our research site. We are working in the Agincourt subdistrict in Mpumalanga province, which is in the northeastern part of the country. It's mostly rural and entirely Black African. Under apartheid, this used to be a sending area for labor migrants to mines in Johannesburg. Even today, there are very few labor market opportunities, tourism, small business, suboptimal services. And then it is also a home of a demographic surveillance system. And what is that? And that is this. And this was started in 1992 to address the lack of data on vital events in these formal homeland areas. It's an ongoing longitudinal data collection in 31 villages, and data updated once a year, births, deaths with verbal autopsies, in and out migration, and then selected modules and periodic on various topics, right? And the population is now approximately 116,000 people, high rates of out migration, but it has actually grown on net. And circular migration is a key feature. And so it's actually, this is a place in which trying to keep track of who belongs where and what is considered a household is a very, it's a challenging issue. So in this, my collaborator, Mike White, who is the PI for this study, funded by NIH. It's a 5-year cohort study aimed at better understanding the relationships between migration, urbanization, and adult health in South Africa. And what they're doing is basically following migrants who leave the Agincourt site. Right? And so the data collected a lot of stuff on migration, obviously, motivation, migration, residence histories, household rosters, remittances, attributes and destination locations, employment, and of course, a whole battery of questions on adult health and well-being, including sleep, and we also have depression as well. In wave 2, maternity and paternity histories were added. So we have just the age, sex, and current location of all children. Target sample started with about 3,700 individuals, age 18 to 39, drawn from the DSS, which is just a random sample. Wave 1, they did very well with follow-up, 3103, and it was all done in person. And as you can see, the splits by 1886 are actually non-migrants, residents, and another 1221 are migrants, right? And of course, this changes at every wave because people are changing statuses. Wave 2 was actually done by phone. Again, very good follow-up. And wave 3, which is the one that I'm going to be using, was also done by phone, they managed to retain just under 3,000 people. Even though this is a longitudinal study, today I'm only going to just present some cross-sectional results from one wave, partly because the whole data set was not actually ready to do the longitudinal, but that is certainly something that is in what we plan to do. So just so that's just a map of South Africa. You can see where the red circle, that's where the study site is. On the left-hand side and the bottom, these are all the study villages, the 31 villages. And on the right side, it kind of gives you an idea of where these people are actually moving to. So all the green areas, right in the middle there is actually Johannesburg. So it is in that Johannesburg area, but there is also these small towns up in the north, a little bit in the south, where actually migrants are actually headed, right? And there is some, actually, if you think about it, there's, moving to Johannesburg is actually a huge risk, right? Because it is far, it's 500 kilometers. It's actually quite a big distance, so it costs money. Travel, etc. And also that, again, as I said, crime is a big problem. And also that just the job opportunities. There's absolutely no guarantee right now that you're going to get a job when you get to Johannesburg. And even if you do, that it's extremely unstable. This is just, this is actually work that we did a couple of years ago. And this is just a diagram just to give you an idea of what these dispersed households look like. And so way in the right, where the node is sort of the rural starting point, if you like. And what we tried to do is actually map out where different people go and distances, and trying to look at the relationships between the people who live in these places and the origin household. And kids in this are sort of everywhere. They may be in rural areas, they may spend some time back in the urban communities, go back. So there's a lot of movement that is actually, and ostensibly they also, I think, actually help keep these connections stronger, right? The actual movement of children. Okay, so this is not a particularly fairly simple analysis. We're looking just at the migrants, about 1525. Our dependent variable is sleep health. And what we're calling problematic are those people who are experiencing oversleep, so over 9 hours, or sleep deficiency, which is less than 6 hours, or have poor sleep quality as measured by the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index. You have to score greater than or equal to 6. The quantity categorization actually comes from the National Sleep Foundation, and this was actually validated for South Africa as well. So that's where we are. And then healthy, of course, is recommended 6 to 9 hours and also having a PSQI score of less than 6. So we're sort of trying to work with both the quality and the quantity. Our key exposure variables is just having a child, and we're focusing on young children, not older ones, because if you bring in older children, you get into issues of fosterage, which is another question entirely, and the idea that actually young children are more dependent on parents. So we're focusing on just having a young child under the age of 5. And then we're also looking at the living arrangements question. Do you have at least one kid who's not living with you? Do all of them live with you? Or the reference group of not having any children? And analysis-wise, we're just doing some logistic regression to estimate the odds of experiencing problematic sleep health, controlling for age, sex, employment, education, remittances, and destination. We're running some interaction models to look at the possibility that it varies by sex of migrants, destination, or employment. And then we also did some propensity score matching to try to actually hone in on this issue of selection. Now, this could also, and also to compare what the results are looking like. And also because we know that selection is part of the story here. And we're particularly interested in age, sex, education, employment to try to see whether those estimates are different from what we get from the regression, and some would say more robust. And propensity score matching, as some of you may be aware, is the quasi-experimental technique of matching both the control and the treatment group. And so in some sense, what are we trying to do is see, okay, how much of this is selection, or is there any evidence here of any kind of causal relationship between parenthood, parenting stress, and sleep outcomes? Okay, so let's start just with some sample descriptives. What I've done is just the first 2 columns are just have a child, have a young child, or not have a young child, and the other 2 are further broken down by residence, by living arrangement. But I think first thing I wanted to point out is just the issue of not employed. We seem to think, okay, if you're a migrant, you must be going there for work. But as you can see, these numbers, even with, they range from 42 to 55% actually in the state of unemployed. They don't have a job as a migrant, which right there should make us think about how we think about migration in terms of these economic benefits, right? And this is because you may go somewhere with the promise of a job, and there is no job when you get there, and you might be, employed for 2 months, and you don't have a job afterwards. So I think it is notable that the percentage of folks who are actually not employed are so high. I think what you also find is that, of course, more than half of our migrants do have at least one child under the age of 5. And out of those, the vast majority actually don't live with them, they live elsewhere. And so, with grandparents, whoever in rural communities. The other thing I wanted to point out, it's in the last column. I don't know how to move that, but okay.
If you move it to the top of the picture.
Like that. How about that? Okay, right. And so just to say that it's not surprisingly, those who have all their kids living with them tend to be more female, as we might expect, and also are by far have the highest rates of being unemployed. This is just where are they going? And as I said now, the Gauteng is where Johannesburg is. It's probably not surprising that those people who don't have young children, they're the ones who are sort of, that's where the highest, they tend to have high percentages going to Gauteng. because as I said, it's a much more difficult environment to sort of survive in, let alone also have children with. And other rural communities, I think it's interesting that those people who have their young children living with them tend to be also moving towards other rural sort of towns, right? Maybe for seasonal labor, that kind of stuff. The frequency of contact, I think I just wanted to point out, for the most part, 44% have at least contact with their children weekends and monthly, and another 38% see them on holidays. So the vast majority do attempt to maintain some regular contact with their kids. And these are places in which cell phone use is ubiquitous, and so social media, et cetera. Okay, so now we get to our dependent variable, which has been, we've struggled. So I'll just, so as you can see, the vast majority all report having recommended sleep. And the other second thing is the oversleep. Now, and actually very few, or rather relatively few, actually report having insufficient sleep. Now, this is something that we have tried to, there's another project going on at the site run by Lisa Berkman on adult health, and we were actually trying to compare some of their sleep outcomes. And this oversleep issue turns out that it's actually coming up in different projects in South Africa, and what exactly the oversleep, but this is something that is not just this study, but it's been, we're finding, and I'm still trying to get my head around what actually oversleep means and what is its actual significance in this kind of situation. But what we tried to do, because of these small numbers, we basically took that, as I said, and combined it with the PSQI, which again is not particularly that high. The people who are reporting poor sleep quality is also pretty low. So, this is what we have in terms of the data, and I'm not entirely happy with it, but this is what we've been trying to work with the data that we have. And so with these numbers, what we get is, using this index, this is the distribution that you get for the problematic sleep. I'm sorry, I didn't put the percentages, but they're actually pretty similar across these categories. Okay, so now let's get to some of the results. So the first one, now this is where, is whether having a child, so you don't care about living arrangement, just having a child, does that have an impact on sleep quality, or is there a relation to problematic sleep? And I think very, very, contrary to what we thought we would find here that having a young child is actually associated with lower odds of experiencing problematic sleep, which is definitely as puzzling, and it is a puzzle that we're still kind of trying to work through. And what's also very notable, of course, are the people who are not employed, which is, of course, very, very significant. And these are much more likely to have problematic sleep. Now, you could say that's the whole time substitution effect, right? So you're not employed, and so you're basically sleeping a lot. It might still mean you are stressed, but I think that's what's going on there. Now, with the children, this is a little more tricky, because you could say, well, of course, you have a kid, and so that's where the time is going. And so you can't, it makes sense that you're not taking your time and putting it into childcare and not into sleep, or at least oversleep. But I think the one pushback I would give is, if you just flip the coding, what you're going to have, it's going to tell you that having a child is actually associated with, improved good sleep health, right? And so what does that mean? And so I think one of the ways in which we're thinking about it, does it actually indicate some sort of stability, either in the union with the father of the child, that might, so what we're actually picking up here is actually the relationship quality, which we don't have actual data for. Is that what's going on? But what is the stability aspect? Because you wouldn't think that having a child should be associated with actually lower odds of problematic sleep. That's not what intuitively we would think, especially thinking about stress and responsibility. But this is what we're finding, that having a kid is actually, in some sense, protective of sleep. And then when we go to the living arrangements, it gets even more interesting, because what you're finding here is that there's, if you have all your young kids living with you, you are also now it's even more significant, less likely to have problematic sleep, right? And that's also, why? Like, why might that be? And we're still sort of we're struggling with this, trying to actually figure out what might be going on here. I mean, what is it about children actually being with you, living with you, that might actually be linked to good sleep? And so, because this is not what we expected to find, because we thought that this would be added stress, et cetera, but we're actually finding the opposite. And this is after controlling for employment, education. And I should also say we did control for union status as well. So that's actually in here, didn't change anything. We also tried putting in having older children. We also put that in, that didn't change it either. So basically, is this sort of leading to this question of, is there something protective of having young kids with you? The sex of migrant matter, well, the interaction effect suggests no. There's no interaction effect, but if you look within women, again, you find this, this effect of having all the kids live with you, once again, good for you, at least in terms of sleep. And what is this about? Is this something about, particularly for women, who again, as I said, are not gaining their entire sort of, in terms of their emotional stability, since it cannot come from good, stable jobs, et cetera, is there something about actually having a child and also having a child with you that is actually playing some sort of a beneficial role as a stress mitigation? So what's interesting is though, and this gives me a little bit more confidence with the measure, because the destination here does seem to matter, and it's going in the direction that we expected it to. So if I told you Gauteng migrants, which Gauteng is a place with actually more crime, more economically vulnerable, et cetera, I mean, it's just sort of borderline significant, but you do have people who are living, have children and in Gauteng actually are reporting, have higher odds of experiencing problematic sleep compared to those who are not in those places. And that's both for having a child and also especially for those who live with all their children. Again, you have definitely much higher odds of facing problematic sleep compared to non-Gauteng migrants. So the destination does definitely seem to matter here. And it gives me a little more sort of confidence that maybe the measure is working, or at least picking up what we think it's picking up. So the employment story, there's no interaction effect. So you would think that if you're unemployed or very precariously employed, and also the child should have increased impact, right? And you don't find that, certainly not interaction models. And what's interesting here is that if you look just at the stratified models for people who are informally employed or unemployed, again, this peculiar result of having all your children live with you is actually somehow protected. So again, there's this question of what is it? Are children sort of substituting for some other kind of stability or is it that you're just that the stress of actually having your kids somewhere else would be much, much worse than this. At least now you have that they're with you, and so you can actually have more, you have less stress because of that. But that's, again, you find this with employment. And so just to sort of run through, these are just the propensity score estimates. And again, this is when, we just treated all of those, we treated them as, treatment. So having a child live with you, a female, so various things are treated as. And when you look at both so the average treatment effect is actually in some sense on the whole sample. And so you can sort of treat it as like the counterfactual. But the average treatment effect on the treated and I think this is the one that I'm actually kind of focusing on. And so after you actually deal with selection, at least on those 4 covariates, the significance holds for the having a child, the living arrangement, and the female, but it disappears for the destination one. So suggesting that selection is probably the main answer, the main reason why we were finding those kinds of results. And the last one for the employment, well, even though the significance holds, I'm not actually that, I think we should be cautious because as you can see, the match rate is not very good because for propensity score matching, you both look at how well you did on the matches as well as whether the bias actually reduced. And as you can see for the models with the Gauteng and the unemployment, neither of those conditions are met. So I'm not actually very, I think those should be real cautionaries to So we can't actually rule out selection. Okay, so just to wrap up, a large proportion of migrants are parents of young children. The physical separation of migrant parents and their young children continues to be a common practice. However, having a young child as a migrant is associated with lower odds of problematic sleep, and migrants co-residing with these young children face also lower odds of problematic sleep. And among female migrants, those who live with their young children also face lower odds of problematic sleep. And as I just said, the destination story, there does seem to be an effect, but it is probably likely explained entirely by selection. So that's, there may be nothing causal there. And I think what I really wanted to sort of end with is that I think while we are nowhere, this is still work very much in progress, but I think it's leading me to think about the need to consider the overlap of parenting and migration as a package deal. And for this, I'm borrowing Nicholas Townsend's name of a book that he wrote on men and fatherhood in the United States, in which parents are assessing the relative costs and benefits of migration with the costs and benefits of childbearing and childbearing. And I would argue that our existing models are not sort of seeing it that way. And I guess children are more sort of either incidental or almost sort of collateral to the process. And I think it's important to actually position them in much more centrally. And I think we need to rethink the role of children in the lives of migrants. Can they be protective of mental health? Finding should motivate us to revisit the NELM framework, particularly in context of extreme social inequality where returns to migration are not clear and childbearing continues to hold value. And finally, that the findings underscore the need to focus on adult mental health as a function of financial security, parenthood, and parenting obligations, at least in the South African case, and I would argue probably well beyond. I think it goes without saying, there are all sorts of concerns. Certainly this is cross-sectional, so endogeneity, the direction of effects cannot be determined. As I said, the use of sleep as an outcome, we're still struggling with thinking about parsing out the time substitution and stress, what's actually happening. We don't have a whole lot of data on the conditions of children who are separated. And so what we do in the next steps, we plan to use multiple waves of data and sort of a fixed effects framework to look at examine change in parenting and change in outcomes, and possibly also bring in depression as a mediating variable in some kind of structural equation modeling framework, because we know that there is this link between depression and sleep. And so we're trying to parse that out. So I think I will leave it at there. And these are just, but thank you very much for